me tell you one thing that your listeners may not know. You're more likely to be killed by police if you're white in Houston than if you're black in New York City. You're much more likely to be killed if you're white in Phoenix than even if you're black in Chicago, which has got a very high use of exposure.
That's unbelievable.
I'm telling you, the geographic variation actually swamps the racial disparity.
That's a mind-boggling statement. Hi, it's Glenn Loury. You've tuned into The Glenn Show. I am the Merton Stoltz Professor in the Department of Economics at Brown University and John Paulson Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute, which sponsors The Glenn Show. And I'm joined by Rajiv Sethi, who is professor in Barnard College, Columbia University of Economics, and an old friend, colleague, collaborator, co-author. We hung out in Bogota for a couple of summers together. And, I visited his place on Martha's Vineyard, guys, Martha's Vineyard. But Rajiv is no friend and a fine economist. And I'm just excited to be able to talk with him. I'm sure you're going to enjoy the conversation. Welcome, Rajiv.
Oh, thank you, Glenn. It's great to be back. We've had some great conversations over the years, both on your Blogging Heads show and offline.
Yeah, indeed. Offline, talking about all manner of things. So this was not on our agenda, and don't answer if you don't want to. The war in Gaza is creating a lot of consternation on college campuses around the country, including Columbia, right there in New York City, with a heavily Jewish population and, home of the late, great Edward Said, amongst others, and, a focal point. Similar, although perhaps not as intense here at Brown. We're both college professors. What do you think our responsibility is in our respective positions of teacher and researchers and in loco parentis to a certain degree with the young charges that we have? How are you viewing it? What's going on at Columbia, and how are you processing it?
What's going on is not that different from what's going on, I suspect, at Brown and other campuses across the country. There are divisions. There are people with very, very strong feelings on all sides of this issue, and other people who just want to find out really where they should stand, how they should think about it. And our responsibility, I feel, is to create an environment that in which constructive dialogue can occur, where people can learn, listen, and possibly think about whether they want to modify, adjust their positions. And that hasn't really happened. Then the environment is much more acrimonious, too acrimonious to allow for that. I've heard that things along those lines have been happening at Dartmouth, where our former president, Jan Bylock, went, but partly through sort of conversations and collaborations between heads of Jewish studies and Middle Eastern studies departments there. That's the kind of thing I think we should be facilitating, that kind of dialogue. And, we are not finding it on campus, but we are finding it in unusual places. You've been on the Comedy Cellar podcast with Noam Dorman, and it's been fascinating for me to watch. Aside from your podcast, there are maybe 3 or 4 that I listen to regularly. And one of them is the Comedy Cellar, and he has had, for example, he has strong feelings on this issue. My understanding is that he's a Zionist, pro-Israel. But he has had Norman Finkelstein on with Eli Lake on exactly the same episode, just having at it with each other.
I saw it.
That was fascinating to me. That's the kind of thing. You ask, what's our responsibility? I feel that these voices, no matter how fringe they may be considered by people who oppose them, ought to be brought into contact with each other. And it's not happening really on campus. But it is happening in various places in the podcast space.
It's interesting that you mentioned Noam Dorman,
yeah,
who's the proprietor of Comedy Cellar and host of this podcast that you're talking about. He's a good friend of mine. I've done shows from the Comedy Cellar on a couple of occasions. Noam and I have gotten to know each other, and I'll tell you a story.
Yeah.
And you're right. He does have a strong pro-Israel position on the conflict. But he is open and he is very much driven by facts and by argument and, is willing to talk with people about it. His relationship with Finkelstein, for example, is almost comic. The Comedy Cellar is an appropriate venue to see these two guys going at each other.
Yeah.
But the story I want to tell you is that Noam called me up and he said, "Can I come up and take you and your wife out to dinner?" He lives in New York City. I live in Providence, Rhode Island. As you know, it's a 3-hour drive.
Yeah.
He comes up in the company of Coleman Hughes and their respective spouses. Coleman is engaged, his fiancée, and Noam's wife. And they take Lawan and I out to a very nice restaurant, very nice dinner. I don't know, 4 or 5 hour dinner. And apropos what you just said about what the role of the university is at a moment like this, he comes with a bag full of books.
Wow.
For me.
Wow.
To educate me, as it were, about the history and the nuances and whatnot of this conflict, which is 100 years old.
Yeah.
And I've been reading several. I've been reading Benny Morris's One State, Two State, for example, which is a review of the arguments about how you create the political foundation for a multi-state, resolution of the Jewish and Arab population conflict in Palestine. Anyway, I've been reading the books. I'm getting an education, and Noam's coming on the show.
That's
the
great.
Glenn Show.
That's great. He has had, aside from the episode with Finkelstein and Eli Lake, he has had Rashid Khalidi, who's a Columbia professor on the show. The first half hour of that really went nowhere, but then towards the end of that episode, there was some really fascinating exchanges. And I'm just trying to think, Benny Morris. Benny Morris was on his show as well recently. So I listened to that podcast. I listened to basically yours, his, Tara Henley. My favorite podcast is actually Lean Out, Tara Henley's podcast. I subscribe to her on Substack, even though everything is available free of charge. I think she's wonderful.
I don't know it. I suppose I should
Lean Out. It's only half an hour an episode. It's just my favorite. And, she talks about, she's from the journalism sphere and somewhat disaffected, but she has very interesting folks on, and it's short enough that I can listen to on the way to work. Those three, I think, on sort of opinion related podcasts are my favorites. Yours, hers, and Comedy Cellar. And so, aside from the Finkelstein Eli Lake episode, aside from Rashid Khalidi's one, he had Benny Morris on, and Benny Morris is interesting because Benny Morris has characterized, and he did so on the show. The situation in the West Bank is as similar to apartheid, based not on race but on nationality, and that that ruffles quite a lot of feathers. And Benny Morris is not in any sense, affiliated with the Palestinian cause. He's very much a respected Israeli historian, but he recognizes that the conditions on the West Bank, not in Israel proper, but on the West Bank, are comparable to apartheid, and he said so. Now, they went back and forth. I mean, I think Noam...
But what's his position on the war? On Gaza?
Benny Morris was one of the people who... I think he sees... I don't know what his position is on the conduct of the war. I think he sees the war itself as somewhat necessary. But he's one of the many eminent signatories to a letter a couple of months before the October 7th attacks, which pointed out that the conditions on the West Bank were leading to a catastrophe for Israel. So Benny Morris I find to be an interesting character, but also Rashid Khalidi at Columbia. So they are coming at it from very different...
Well, from very different points. Have you read Ilan Pappé's book, at The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine?
No, I have not. I honestly, to tell you the truth, I've been trying to absorb as much information as I can because I want to be informed about this situation, both historically informed and about events on the ground. But given all my, I'm interim chair of my department. My chair is on leave. I have, I'm completely swamped with other things, so I can't read a whole lot of books. But I'm trying to listen to the podcasts and newsletters and just try to learn as much as I can, as indeed I think our students want to do.
Now, this is a classic self-censorship situation here.
Yes, absolutely.
Rajiv and I have been talking for, 25 years. About this socio-linguistic phenomenon of not being willing to say exactly what you think in social companies for fear of others making an inference about you based on what you say that is adverse. And all the complexities that go in on that, I have a if I may, classic essay that was published in the journal Rationality and Society in 1994. That's coming up on 30 years, which elaborates on this, and others have written about it. And there's a lot to say. But people want to know what side you're on. You're talking that, I mean, I'm getting this here at the podcast, and I apologize to those who may be followers of the Glenn Show and who are disappointed with the set of guests whom I've had to talk about this issue. I had Omar Bartov, my colleague and historian, very distinguished historian of genocide studies and of Holocaust studies on the show. He wants the war to stop. He's calling for a ceasefire. I've had Norman Finkelstein on the show. Norman, not to talk about Israel or Gaza, to talk about his book on woke intellectual corruption.
I read that book after listening to him on your episode. Cover to cover, I read it.
But he's a fierce critic of Zionism. That is, Norman Finkelstein is. I've had John Mearsheimer on the show, the student of international affairs at the University of Chicago, political scientist, who's written a book with Stephen Walt called The Israel Lobby. Okay.
Yeah.
Not to talk about Israel, to talk about, frankly, about Ukraine. That's what he mostly talked about when I had him on the show. But people know that he's this guy. He has this, mark on him in the minds of certain people because of the book that criticized the Israel Lobby.
Yeah.
On the show. And then people are saying, like, when are you going to have a pro-Israel person on the show?
Yeah.
To which I'm saying, okay, fair enough. I will. But don't ask me for a loyalty test here. Don't make me have to choose a side about something that's complicated, where in effect, what you're saying is, who are you? My willingness to talk to somebody is now a black mark on me. It has to be countered by talking to somebody else in order to prove to you that I'm on your side. That's what this is about? I object.
Yeah. So, lots to process there, Glenn. I going back to your paper, the self-censorship paper, that I think it's one of the best papers written by an economist. I don't call it an economics paper. It's too broad for that. It's just, it just spans, huge space. It's beautifully written, as is your memoir, which we can also talk about if you like.
But, well, let's do.
But on self-censorship, that is exactly right. There are many, many ideas in that paper. Some have been developed by theorists like Banerjee and Somanathan and Stephen Morris.
Yeah.
But there are other ideas in that paper that have not been developed. And one of the most important ones, I discussed this at the Festschrift in your honor, as did Jane Humphreys and several other people. But one of the most important ideas is the idea of the ad hominem inference, and you said that it is something that is disparaged or looked down upon, but it's completely rational. So when people speak, when people say something, the inference that people draw about their character and values is not necessarily related to the literal content of what they're saying. It is related to who else would say that kind of a thing. What kind of character? That's a key part of that paper. Now, the fear of being judged, the fear of having one's values and character brought into question causes self-censorship. And this is very much related to what's going on campus right now, which is the topic that we started off with. Many, many schools are considering adopting principles that were codified in the Calvin Report, 1967 report out of Chicago, which argued for university neutrality. Let the university itself, and even maybe divisions like departments, not make statements on political issues of the day unless they directly involve, university affairs, so that faculty can be free. The Calvin Report says, faculty ought to be free to take positions, no matter how extreme, no matter how out of step with the mainstream. But in order for them to be free to do so, the university itself cannot take any positions. And this has been adopted by Williams College, for example. Many others have debated adopting something similar. Although at this time, it seems that the accusation is made that it's being adopted opportunistically. You don't want to make a statement on the Middle East right now, so you adopt these principles, and maybe in a year or two, you'll go back to the old ways of doing things. And then the other thing that colleges are thinking about adopting is the Chicago Principles. I think this is 1994. Another document out of Chicago, which was basically about free expression on campus. And the most important component of that, in my opinion, is a condemnation of the heckler's veto. That if somebody's invited onto campus, no matter how offensive their speech may be to some segments of the population, those who would like to listen to them ought to be allowed to do so without interference. You can protest, in various ways that don't disrupt the event. And Columbia adopted Chicago principles a few years ago. Barnard is debating doing so now. But my position on these two things, I think they're admirable. Frankly, I think we should adopt them, but they won't do anything. And the reason I don't think the effect will be negligible, and the reason I think it will be negligible, is precisely because of the self-censorship incentives that are in place. You can have the adoption of principles that aim to foster dialogue, aim to reduce the pressure to self-censor, but it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen unless people genuinely feel that they won't be judged, they won't be punished for views that are out of step with the majority opinion on campus. And that's going to take something more than just adopting Kelvin or adopting Chicago.
I think a couple of things. I think of Tom Schelling, the great economist Tom Schelling, my friend. He passed away in 2016.
Yeah.
And the problem is self-binding strategy. So, there's the problem of self-command. How do I tying yourself to the mast, as Ulysses does, so that when the vessel sails past the sirens, he can hear the call, but not be free to respond to it. And I think there's something, whatever the merits of the principles in terms of the internal structure of the university, there's something to be said for a university announcing in advance. And your point about, is this a strategic move on their part? They're saying it now because they don't want to answer the question, but having laid that down as a predicate, we don't talk about this, relieves them of the need to respond to someone who says, what's your position? What's your position? And I think that would be a good thing as a general rule.
I agree. In fact, I've stated this on my newsletter that you can't go back on it. You might be tempted to do it opportunistically, but there is a commitment there. You would look ridiculous if 2 years from now you said, okay, we are now no longer abiding by these principles. So, absolutely right. Making a public statement is self-reinforcing to some degree. My point was not so much that we shouldn't do it, or that if it's done, it can be neglected. I'm saying it won't make much of a difference, precisely because it doesn't really address the issue of self-censorship. Because the ad hominem inference remains in place. People are going to judge characters and values based on speech exactly as they were previously. Just committing the university to neutrality, abstaining from making statements about the events of the day, doesn't change what people feel about the events of the day and how they judge their peers when they make statements about the events of the day. Those things remain in place.
Where, in your view, is this most injurious to the quality of public discourse, this fear of the ad hominem inference and this climate of self-censorship? What's at stake? Yeah.
Oh, what's at stake is everything. I mean, what's at stake is knowledge. You brought this out in your paper, in fact. If we don't debate these things openly and honestly, the distribution of opinion is concealed. The distribution of expressed opinion starts to vary from the distribution of held opinion. And
would you be prepared to say, in the context of the war in Israel-Gaza, that the U.S. policy is not as effective as it would be if we didn't have the constraints on our discourse? And
yes. For example, so those are the stakes. Yes, those are the stakes. The stakes are measured in thousands of lives and in guns and butter and economic and social stakes.
How do I avoid then the thought that maybe the U.S. is unquestioned, we have your back no matter what position, is not in the interest of the country, but can't be altered because the discourse about the question is hemmed in all kinds of ways along the lines that you're gesturing at here?
Yes, exactly. And That's exactly right. And if you think about a companion paper to yours, when I teach your paper, I teach also Elizabeth Noel Neumann's paper on the spiral of silence.
I know that paper. I know the book.
Yeah, and the dam can break, right? It can, because you get this variance between expressed opinion and held opinion. At some point, people suddenly start to change. You've had, you've had very dramatic changes in opinion, for example, about same-sex marriage. And so it could happen,
and it happened very quickly. This is also Timur Kuran. Private Truths, Public Lies.
Oh, absolutely.
I have a paper, a little talk that I've been giving recently called "Naked Emperor Equilibria Can Be Unstable." And it's exactly this point. It's a naked emperor equilibrium. If the emperor is naked, but no one will say so because no one wants to be thought to be the person who speaks out of turn about the emperor.
Yeah.
And that's not stable, because as soon as a few people break the taboo, then everybody starts to know that other people know that the naked emperor is a fraud.
That's
and the whole thing collapses.
That's right. The way I would put it is that it has, I wouldn't say it's unstable, but it has a small basin of attraction. A few perturbations can get you out of the basin of attraction, and then you're zooming off somewhere totally different.
I accept that as a refinement of my argument.
Okay.
So you're interim chair of your department.
Yeah.
Is there drama? I mean, I know you can't talk about individual cases, but is it pretty straightforward?
Yeah, it's the worst kind of chair to be, because you have to learn all the recent changes in procedures. There are cases going up, tenure cases, promotion, reappointment, and so on. But nothing complicated, nothing acrimonious. It's totally fine. It's just that the workload is just very, very high.
So you mentioned my memoir. I didn't want that subject to fall by the wayside. Everyone should know that Late Admissions, Confessions of a Black Conservative, my forthcoming memoir from Norton, May 2024, available for pre-order at your bookseller of choice, is coming out, and Rajiv has read it and offered a wonderful blurb review, short review that you'll find at the bookseller's webpage about the book. And thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for letting me see the early copy. Actually, I don't think there's any harm in disclosing this. I tried to get you to change the subtitle. I thought that it would put off some people, some readers. And of course, you, for very good reason, were insistent on keeping it. But I would like to note that out of the 6 people who blurbed the book, who are on the website, I think only Shelby Steele would really qualify as a conservative in the popular imagination. I mean, you've got people like Randall Kennedy, you've got Mark Lilla, you've got
Robert Putnam.
My goodness, probably one of the premier sociologists of his generation.
Thomas Chatterton
Williams. Yeah, exactly. There's one more I'm missing. Steele, Thomas Chatterton Williams, Shelby Steele, Randall Kennedy, Mark Lilla, and myself. Yeah, that's 6. Yeah, sorry. I don't know how I got in there. I'm honored to be to have been given the opportunity. But I wanted to ask you a couple of things. One thing is, was there a lot that changed? Because of course the blurbs are based on the copy that you sent out originally. I wanted to ask you whether you had to change a lot to get it into the final form, or aside from the title, or whether it's essentially what you had in place to begin with. And then we can talk about the game theoretic aspects of it for a minute, if you like.
Well, it's essentially, I showed you a kind of first draft.
Yeah.
And there were some modifications, but I can't enumerate them.
Right.
I wouldn't anyway. If I remembered, I wouldn't.
Of course. Yeah.
But pretty much intact. What you saw, refinements of language and expression in particular places as you go over with a fine-tooth comb for the last time, kind of thing.
Right. No, the reason I ask is because it's really fascinating how you framed it, right? So you begin the book, I don't know if I'm going to get the quote exactly right, but you begin it by saying, we are playing a game, you and I, reader and author, something like that.
That's it.
So it's strategic. It's, right at the offset, it is about, issues that you have discussed, for example, in your self-censorship paper. It's, what are people going to think of me, when they read this? And you make the argument, and it's such an interesting place to start. You make the argument that by disclosing things about your own life and your own actions that are unflattering, you may be able to convince the reader into taking seriously things that you would like them to believe that are positive, and that it's a price that one has to pay for the credibility that you seek. And that's such an interesting place to start. And that's why I've said to you, I think on an email or maybe a comment on your Substack, that that there's something in this book also for game theorists. Of course, there's something in it for all kinds of people. But I loved reading it. I'm just honored that you gave me the opportunity.
Well, I'm glad that I did, and thank you for kind words. And yes, the game is a theme that it emerges in multiple places throughout the narrative, including that preface that you just alluded to, in which I tell the reader, I'm going to be writing between the lines, you're going to be reading between the lines, and here we are. And how do you say anything credible when people know that you have an interest to say things that are to your own self-aggrandizement, your own benefit? And the idea of earning your credibility by taking a risk, by exposing my own foibles and failings and so on, this kind of idea. Yeah. So but and I mentioned Tom Schelling earlier.
Yeah.
He was a dear friend of mine, a great economist, Nobel laureate, author of The Strategy of Conflict, this classic book about conflict. Clausewitz of our time, you could probably get away with saying about him. And he was a mentor of mine when I was a young economist at Harvard. And he's a game theorist through and through, a master of the strategic analysis of complex situations of human interaction. So I deploy this device of the game at multiple levels throughout the narrative, and it's one of the intellectual sinews, one of the things that's holding the overall construct together. It's not just a series of anecdotes in which I say this happened, that happened, that happened. There are ideas that are unifying over the arc of my life. I think I've said enough about the book, which is not yet available for purchase, but you can
see you can see the influence of Schelling, no doubt. Yes.
So anyway, enough about me. What are you working on?
So I am working, Glenn, for a long time now on policing related issues. My work is, broadly speaking, related to information. So I work on multiple different topics, but I have a book with Dan O'Flaherty. We talked about it on your show. It came out in 2019, Shadows of Doubt, that looks at interactions between strangers. When strangers interact, they have to make sometimes very quick judgments with very significant welfare consequences for both the actor and for the party that is being acted upon. And this is especially important in the criminal justice context. So with officers and suspects, with offenders and victims, with jurors and defendants, judges making bail decisions, prosecutors and witnesses and other witnesses, and so on. So they know very little about each other, and their well-being depends very much on having an accurate assessment of other people's motives, actions, and expectations. And sometimes, and in this kind of situation, stereotypes, both based on race, gender, ethnicity, but also based on things like tattoos and accents and build and so on, can really affect how interactions play out. So that's one sort of set of themes that I've been exploring with my colleague and friend Dan O'Flaherty for about 10, 15 years now. And we're continuing with that. So I'm still working on the police use of lethal force, but now particularly focused on history. So we have data from the 1930s. One thing that's very difficult if one wants to look at the history of this phenomenon in the US is that data is very patchy. You've got reasonably good data for about the last decade, and then you've got few things here and there in the 1970s and 80s. And, we found in the Schomburg archives here in New York City, data that was collected for Gunnar Myrdal's American Dilemma by a sociologist called Arthur Raper. And we digitized it and we're looking at it. And,
this is data on what, Rajiv?
This is data on police use of lethal force in the 1930s, 35 to 40. It is
Wow.
It is, the departments were very honest about it at that time. They were not interested in obfuscating anything. And Arthur Aper wrote to them, and they wrote back and gave him data. And this is only 228 departments, mostly across the South. So we can't say much about how things have changed in the country as a whole. But we're looking, Dan and I and a bunch of our research assistants are trying to see, what has happened in these agencies, and what can one say about a century later, because we do have good data now for the last decade or so. So that's one of the things that I've been looking at, continuing the work that was in that book, especially the chapter on lethal force. So that's one thing. And the other thing I'm looking at is information related also. It's about the aggregation of information through prediction markets. So this sounds like, night and day, apples and oranges, very different, but they're linked together with the informational story. And so I've been looking at prediction markets as forecasting mechanisms, especially, and that interest arose during COVID, actually. I've been looking at prediction markets for many years, but during COVID, a large number of models made forecasts of COVID cases, deaths, hospitalizations, and submitted them to the CDC. At one point, maybe 80 or more models were submitted, and they were in such wide disagreement with each other and kept changing from one week to the next. These are basically epidemiological models that had been modified in one way or another. And I have looked previously at alternative forecasting mechanisms through markets, prediction markets, where one doesn't pre-select the variables as you do in a model. You don't fit it to historical data. Anything that somebody thinks in their head is relevant to the future can be expressed in a market price, and trying to compare the predictions of markets and models. So that's another thing I'm working on, trying to look at how markets and models have performed relative to each other in forecasting elections 2016 onwards.
So this interests me. What little I can remember of my econometrics instruction about parametric specifications versus non-parametric, about not committing yourself to a particular structure that you're then trying to get the right parameters on, but rather leaving it open to a kind of I'm not even sure how to express it. But I detected something of that in what you just said.
Yes.
That modeling involves committing to untested, non-empirical, but consequential specification decisions.
Yeah.
It's linear or it's not linear. There are 6 or there are 26 things on the right-hand side of a regression equation or whatever.
That's right.
Whereas the kind of information aggregation that a market allows is based upon the variation in the population of individuals' own assessment devices, which can be all over the place and are not tied down by any one
exactly right
framework.
Exactly right. So a couple of examples from work that I had a while ago with David Rothschild at Microsoft Research. If you think about, let's say, debate performance, this is very difficult to put in a model of election outcomes. But if you looked at markets during the first Obama-Romney debate, they moved very substantially. Obama was quite unprepared. He made up for it in the subsequent 2 debates, but Mitt Romney was thought to have won quite convincingly that debate, and it moved prices in the market. And you'd think intuitively, yes, if debates matter, that ought to happen. But there's no model that would pick that up until such time as it appeared into the usual data, the opinion polls, people's reactions to the debate, data on vote intentions, and so on. And the other thing we looked at was when Osama bin Laden was captured and killed. How can you put that into a model? Those kinds of variables, and that moved the markets very substantially. That caused Obama's re-elect likelihood to jump up in prediction markets. And of course, you'd think, okay, that makes a lot of sense, but you can't put that in as a variable ahead of time.
There's something I'm not understanding here. So Osama bin Laden is killed. Obama is running for re-election, and there's an election outcome. He wins. And the question is, what's the relationship between the killing of Osama bin Laden and the outcome of the election? And what we're doing is inferring from how the killing of Osama bin Laden change the prediction market's assessment of the likelihood that Obama would win.
Correct.
And we're concluding from that in fact, the prediction market's assessment and the electoral outcome are tied together in some way.
That's right. So
it's that last step that I'm not getting.
Okay, let me use a very contemporary example. There's a market on predicted for the vice presidential choice of the Republican nominee. All right, I can't think of a model really that would give you that, because it's based on private thoughts that are going on probably in Donald Trump's head. Now, in that market, the leader with about 24% probability of being selected is Elise Stefanik. Many people would consider that quite reasonable based on recent events, the congressional testimony and her endorsement and her introductory speech in New Hampshire and so on. And then you have got, I forget now the name, the governor of South Dakota, I think it is, who's second. And then you've got Tim Scott. And then you've got Vivek Ramaswamy. I personally don't think those last two are going to be selected, but those are the four leaders. And you have got a market, and it's a high frequency forecast. So every few minutes it could change, right? Depending on events happening.
And are people coming in and out, by the way? Can you buy forward on and so on? So you can make money as the thing is fluctuating.
These are completely liquid. You can sell, you can buy a contract and sell it a fraction of a second later. In fact, there are algorithms that do that in some markets that try to make short-term movements in prices and predict short-term movements in prices and trade accordingly. But that's right. They're completely liquid. They're peer-to-peer markets. So the exchange doesn't take a position. So if I bet, so I'll give you an example. So I guess for Trump and Biden, they're in the mid 40s, mid to low 40s, the likelihood of being president, right? You can interpret these roughly as probabilities. And the reason you can is because prices are forced by trading activity and arbitrage considerations to add up to one. You have to make some adjustment for the fee structure. But so suppose that, there's a...
I mean, people who are not economists may not get that.
Yeah.
People are buying, in effect, a piece of paper that says, should this outcome occur, you will be paid $1. And the question is, what does that piece of paper cost?
Exactly. So right now,
among all the possible options, the sum of that cost has to be one. Otherwise, there'll be an opportunity to just by buying and selling these pieces of paper alone to make money.
You'd make money. Suppose that the price of the contract to buy Biden was 55 cents, right, for $1, and the price for Trump was also 55 cents. It's not. It's about 45 for both of them. But suppose it were. Then what I'd do is I'd take the opposite position. I'd sell both, and I'm basically buying $1.10 for $1 because one of them is not.
One of them is going to lose.
One of them's going to lose. So that activity, that trading activity, forces the prices into alignment in a way that you can interpret as probabilities with some adjustment for fees. But right now you have got Biden and Trump neck and neck on these markets at around.
When I interpret them as probabilities, whose probability is it? Objective or subjective? Is it the, as it were, median buyer's estimate that I'm assessing when I use these prices?
That's actually a very deep question, Glenn. People often will interpret it as the belief of the market, the set of participants collectively in some fashion. What it is actually, the price at any point in time stays where it is, right? To the extent that it does, because people who disagree with the price have already accumulated positions and hit their risk limits. So imagine, just because the price of the Biden contract is 45 cents, right? And by the way, we're not talking about dollars and cents here. There are over $100 million of open interest in this market. So, you've got a lot of, you can buy thousands of contracts. So suppose the price of the Biden contract is 45 cents. If I buy a contract at 45 cents, what I'm doing is I'm betting against somebody who's buying the opposite contract that Biden is going to lose and is paying 55 cents. The exchange will collect 45 from me, collect 55 from them. And then if Biden wins, I get the $1. And if Biden loses, they get the $1. So the exchange is not holding a position at all. And so what does the probability, the 45, actually mean? The 45 doesn't mean that everybody agrees that Biden's probability is 45. It means that those who think that he's got a 50 or 60% chance of winning have already bought a whole bunch of contracts, and they don't want to buy more because it's, they've hit their risk limits. And those who think that 45 is too low, they would rather buy the other side of the contract. They've hit their risk limits. And so really, it's a balance. The price is a sort of a balance of beliefs.
I want to observe that there is a model here. It's not a model of the phenomenon whose probability is being assessed, but there's a model of the behavior of the people who are market participants.
Exactly.
Your invocation of risk limits suggests to me a whole decision theoretic framework where a person is trying to decide how much. And if they were risk neutral, there would be no limit to how much they would be willing to buy. But of course, no one is
the budget
no,
even if they're risk neutral,
the budget constraint, and can't borrow because
you can't borrow.
People are going to say, "I'm not." They're going to look for collateral.
You can borrow. You can borrow to buy stocks. You can buy stocks on margin, but the exchange will not let you buy. Most exchanges will not let you buy these contracts on margin. But because the worst case loss is zero. I mean, you could end up with nothing. But you're exactly right. But what's interesting is, so then that raises a puzzle, right? Because your average participant is not your average voter. And the participants in these markets are young, they are male, they may ideologically skew one way or the other.
That's interesting.
They're not typical of a voter. It's not like an opinion poll where you have to weight it to get, if you take an opinion poll and it's let's say 60% male, you want to do some reweighting and upweight the women who are responding in your sample to get a representative poll. Not so in markets. So what happens is that they disagree. People, they may be similar demographically, but they disagree. And then there are a few people, David Rothschild and I estimated less than 10%, who are willing to switch positions. They'll go, they'll bet on Trump sometimes, they'll bet on Biden sometimes, or maybe RFK. They're willing to switch positions based on whether they think the price is too high or too low. And those are the people who really bring a lot of information into the market. And the empirical question is, well, okay, how do they perform? You can measure performance through mean squared error, a Breyer score, for example. But what we have proposed, I proposed in prior work, is something called a profitability test. So imagine that there's a model. So you have models coming out of, let's say, 538, or the Economist had a model of the last presidential election. You can ask yourself the following question. Suppose I believe the model, and I trade based on the model. I endow a hypothetical trader with a budget constraint and with the risk preferences and say, okay, trade based on the model. If you just every day update your position based on what the model is saying, are you going to make or lose money? If you make money, then the model is better than the market. If you lose money, the market is better than the model. That's sort of a test of whether markets perform better than models. So that's the kind of thing that I'm exploring.
You write about this at your blog, Imperfect Information,
yes.
Which people can find at Substack,
yes,
and which is full of all kinds of interesting things. And I love this about you, that as life goes by, it's not all just technical stuff. Some of it is just reporting on the human condition. Your tribute to Bob Solow really moved me. For example, Robert Solow who passed away recently. Well into his 90s, a great economist, Nobel honoree, my dissertation advisor at MIT back in the 1970s. But you did some research, unless it all came off the top of your head, and found out who his students were and who students of his students were and students of the students of his students.
Yes. Oh, yes. Now I remember. Yeah, I was trying to remember what I wrote. Sometimes I
they turn out to be a who's who of the economics profession in the last half century.
It's extraordinary. Of course, you are one of them, right?
I am one of them.
So there is that's right. So let me just, by way of background, say that Bob Solow's granddaughter, Anna Solow Collins, was one of our students, and he came and gave a public lecture in our department a few years ago, and I met him. And so I'll tell you about the family tree, the intellectual family tree that you just mentioned. But I want to first also mention that I spoke to him about you, because you had mentioned Bob Solow in your book, your Du Bois lectures, Anatomy of Racial Inequality, and you had mentioned, you had thanked him and mentioned him, and
inspiring leadership or something to that effect.
Yeah, something to that effect. You had dedicated the book, I believe, to Schelling. But you had mentioned Solow in the preface, and so and he remembered receiving the book from you, I think. But I think he may not even have noticed that he was mentioned. So he said, "Oh, he's going to go back and take a look." So that's just a little anecdote. But that's the only time I think I've met him. But regarding the family tree, so that's really interesting. So there is for every discipline, not every, but I think most disciplines, not just economics, you can go online, and if people go and look at this post, they can find a link to it. You can find people and their graduate students, if they supervise the dissertation, like Solow supervised yours, then you are treated as a descendant, an intellectual descendant of him, a child, if you like. And then if people, if you supervise somebody's dissertation, for example, young Chel Kim, whom we are both working together with right now,
yeah,
he would be a grandchild then of Solow. And you can have great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren. And it's extraordinary. I think, Oliver Hart, for example, I think is a great-great-grandchild. It's really astonishing. And then people I know quite well, Naveen Karthik and Marina Halak. Marina was here at Columbia. Naveen is still here. They are great-grandchildren. And so you get this, and I don't believe that there is anyone. I don't think there's anyone who comes close to Solow in just the total number of people that occupy this family tree who have gone on to do, really significant things. It's astonishing. Martin Weitzman and Peter Diamond, and I could go on, but it's there in the post. And I just played around with this family tree for maybe half an hour or so, but there's a lot there that I wasn't able to capture.
This is an interesting window on the network structure of elite economics, it seems to me. If you look at, and you will be the person bet more than I, because you're more data-driven than I am, who would get on top of this. But, there are a few top departments, 10, 15, that produce a outsized proportion of the people who are distinguished fellows of the association, who are, editors of the journals, who and various other accolades. And a person could say, not every clerk at the Supreme Court has to come from Harvard or Yale.
Yeah.
Not every person who's a fellow of the Econometric Society or who had given subject editing the Econometrica has to be at MIT or Stanford. But they are. I mean, disproportionately. So one consequence of which will be that the family tree that you just got through elaborating for someone who is right at the center of things, as Bob Solow was right at the center of things at MIT, will have this quality that you're talking about. And my question for you, because I know this is the kind of thing you think carefully about, is that a good thing?
It's not a good thing. But at the same time, I want to say that among those in these institutions, Solow is an outlier. He's an outlier. There are many, many people who are at the center of things. At these institutions, it's very hard to find anybody even close to Solow, except maybe if you think of a contemporary, it would be Daron Acemoglu. He has a large number of students. And in fact, one of them, Glenn, I want to mention this, was our student in Bogota. Pascual Restrepo was our student in Bogota as an undergraduate. He then was our TA the second time we taught together.
He was.
And then he went to, I wanted him to apply to Columbia, but he refused. He didn't want to. He only applied to, I think, Stanford, Chicago, MIT, Harvard, and NYU. That's it. Those are the only ones.
Not even UCLA?
No, he didn't.
Which has a lot of students from Columbia.
He got. That's right. He got into everything except, I think, NYU. NYU may have.
As I recall, Rajiv, he participated in Switzerland in a mathematics Olympiad.
Yeah, he won. He
right
won
after
a medal.
He finished his underworked studies before he began PhD work at MIT.
He was a medal winner. So Pascual, we had high hopes for. He worked with Daron. He went to BU, and I believe he's moving, but I don't want to say it publicly. I don't know if it's public yet. But
he got tenure at BU?
Oh yeah, easily. I think so. I think he's got a tenure offer at a very prestigious
at a really
place.
Good place.
Right now, I don't want to say.
And you don't
publicly.
want to say.
Yeah.
No, of course.
But now to your much more important question: is it a good thing?
Yeah.
No, I don't think so. I think that in terms of graduate student selection, criteria are really too narrow. That people are too similar to each other in terms of what they bring to the table. This can take us to a discussion of merit,
which is mathematical, analytic.
Chops,
but not so much historical or sociological or whatever.
And a large prestigious department has the space to take a couple of chances, to get a couple of people who may not fit the regular profile. Now, they're going to struggle through the first year sequence because the first year sequence is itself extremely mathematical. And I've taught in this sequence at Columbia.
Should be?
I think that it's excessive. I think people learn things. And I've taught the math methods course at the PhD level at Columbia and also the micro. Micro, okay, I think people do need to learn. But I think there are things that people who go on to do experimental economics or empirical economics or
they don't have to know.
Causal inference, there are things that they really don't have to know. Burge's theorem of the maximum or advanced topological concepts. So there's an issue of the curriculum. You may want to rethink that, but I do think there isn't enough variation among those who are selected among graduate students. And then going on to the profession as a whole, I think that faculty, when you're hiring faculty, it's worth taking a chance. It's really worth taking a chance on a couple of people who are coming out of programs that are not elite, not at the top, if they show potential, even if their dissertation is a bit rough around the edges, because they haven't been been guided in the latest methodologies and the latest ways of doing things. They may just still have the potential to succeed. And this is very personal for me. My PhD is from the New School, and there are departments. I got lucky. I just got very lucky with publications and had a job offer, which allowed me then at University of Vermont, which allowed me to publish a couple of things and managed to get quite a few papers published in a way that allowed me to get tenure and so on. So I've come from outside. But I take a lot of pride. Maybe more than the average person. If I get a paper in a top journal, I've got, don't want to recite a CV or anything like that, but Econometrica or an AER or JP publication to me means something really quite different from somebody whose advisors have been publishing there routinely. So I think people ought to take a chance.
I just thought of something ironic, Rajiv, because you talked about the police use of lethal force.
Yeah.
And Roland Fryer has written on that subject.
Yes,
and you and he have had public disputation about it.
Yes.
But you have this in common.
Yes.
His PhD is from Penn State.
Yes.
And he did a postdoc at Chicago, but he clawed his way into the upper ranks of the Ivy League and so forth. By the skin of his teeth and the wit and the quality of his mind and the luck of being in the right place at the right time and all that kind of stuff. And, you guys have a lot in common in that respect.
I agree with you. And in fact, I admire Roland for that. And I had concerns about his paper on the police use of lethal force, about generalizing, because I found enormous geographic variation. Let me tell you one thing that your listeners may not know. You're more likely to be killed by police if you're white in Houston than if you're black in New York City. You're much more likely to be killed if you're white in Phoenix than even if you're black in Chicago, which has got a very high use of exposure.
That's unbelievable.
I'm telling you that the geographic variation actually swamps the racial disparity.
That's a mind-boggling statement.
There's a paper of mine with Dan O'Flaherty coming out in the Annual Review of Criminology in January 2024 edition. It's online already in an early version. There's a table in there where people can look. This is from Washington Post data, but you can look at Guardian data. You can look at other crowdsourced data sources. The geographic variation is completely and utterly staggering. And that's one reason why I thought a study that was focused on Houston may not give you generalizable implications.
That's a fair point. Now, do you think, what is this revealing to us? Is it about culture that varies geographically?
Yeah. So I believe that there are four things that are crucially important. Organizational culture, selection practices, the way in which hiring. I shouldn't have said four. I can't think of four at the top of my head, but we've listed. I do think that departments vary very, very substantially and in ways that are correlated regionally. But Phoenix, the use of force in Phoenix, New Mexico is a state with one of the highest rates of deadly force in the U.S. In fact, if you look at every single state, take the top 6 or 7 states with the highest use of deadly force, they all have smaller than the national average black populations. And Nevada comes pretty close, but states like New Mexico, Arizona, California. Um, these states have extraordinarily high use of deadly force compared to the New England states and even the northeastern states, Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey. There's enormous difference, and so in fact, when you aggregate nationally, this is one of the things that um, I have said many times and is discussed in my book with Dan, is that if you just take aggregate statistics, you say, okay, black exposure to lethal force relative to white is 2.5 to 1 or 3 to 1 nationally. That's almost meaningless, because you have something going on that's referred to by statisticians as Simpson's paradox, where, the variation across agencies is so great, and the demographics of the agencies at the high end of lethal force is so different from the ones at the low end that when you aggregate, you really miss the picture. So I mentioned Houston and Phoenix and Los Angeles as being very high lethal force agencies. Now, people who are Black or Latino in these agencies have even higher exposure than white, substantially higher, actually. But it's just that not that many people live there. The populations, the non-white populations are smaller than in Chicago and New York City. So aggregates don't make a whole lot of sense, and individual case studies don't make a whole lot of sense. But anyway, maybe this is rambling too much.
It's interesting what you've been working on: geographic variations in police use of force, historical data that's been uncovered for New York City about the police use of lethal force.
Yes.
Prediction markets. It's all very interesting. But I got to ask you another kind of question before we close.
Please do.
I know you follow politics closely, and you will not have failed to notice, being a man of Indian descent yourself, that 2 of the 6, 7, 8 people who ran for the Republican nomination for president were Indian American.
Mm-hmm.
What do you make of that? Is that a harbinger of things to come? Is that a coincidence? Are you proud?
No, I'm not.
They're Republicans after all, and you're not.
No, I'm not. Even if there were, so for example, one politician that I actually admire quite a lot is Ro Khanna. He's out of Washington. But no, I don't take pride with regard to ethnicity. I don't know, this might sound sort of cliched, but I really believe, and my personal story, my wife is African American, and I've chosen to be American very self-consciously, very deliberately. My approach to people, as much as I can, is what you might call, sort of transracial humanism. It's just, I just don't take particular pride in the accomplishments of even the Indian cricket team. It's just, I'm not sure really how to put this. I feel that culture. One of my favorite essays, I'll just mention this, favorite pieces of writing ever, is this essay by Ralph Ellison, 1917 Time magazine, which I think I've mentioned to you before. And he talks about literature, and he talks about American literature, and he tries to imagine what it would have been like if the influences were only European, and you get to a totally different place. So he talks about Mark Twain, for example, and the effects of the kinds of things, whether it's Faulkner, whether it's Hemingway. I just American literature is something very, very different from anything that could have possibly evolved in Europe. And I see this as a blending of cultural influences in a way that makes it almost meaningless. I don't even like to talk about the United States as a Western country. We've sort of tangled on this before, I think. To me, it's a confluence of forces and cultures in a way that you can't really separate out. So I don't know if that answers in any way your question. I don't take particular pride in Ramaswamy or Haley or even Ro Khanna, who I actually like quite a bit.
It does answer my question, and it's a fine and defensible answer. And I have been known to advocate for transracial humanism myself on occasion.
I think so. Yes, I think that's one of the things I think that draws me to you also. I just think that,
It's been wonderful talking to you. Thank you so much for your kind words about my book. And apropos of what we've just been saying about America, what I loved about your comment, you say the book is revealing. And then you have a number of developments about how it's revealing about the South Side of Chicago in the 1950s, 60s, and so on, revealing about myself and my own struggles, but revealing about America.
Absolutely.
Most of all, revealing about America. And if I can have written a book that the reader will come to the conclusion that I know my country better now than I did before I started, I'd be very, very happy.
Glenn, if I could just quote the last sentence of that blurb, this deeply American story, most of all, this deeply American story is revealing out America. Your story could not happen anywhere else in the world, for better or worse. And it's an American story through and through. And it reveals the country that made you. It's just, I think people will enjoy this and learn from it. And it's going to sell a lot of copies.
He said it, I didn't, but from his lips to God's ears. Thanks so much, Rajiv.
It's been a pleasure. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me back.